I am.
Yes, Professor Simone.
I am beyond thrilled to announce our three fantastic panelists. We have the lovely Gail Simone, the fantastic Caramagna, and the incomparable Peter David. All of whom have a vast wealth of experience writing across different media and different types of comics as well. So we're going to ask them a couple of questions. We're going to welcome your questions, and hopefully you guys will learn something. So how many of you guys are here because you're interested in learning how to write for comics because you might want to do that someday? Well then.
Not really a might, like I hope it happens, I want it to happen. Pretty much.
Well, I guess the first question would be, where do you start? What do you, like?
Begging?
Read Peter's book on how to write comics.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I've had so many people come up to me at conventions and say, what can you tell me about writing comics? And I could answer that question for several hours. And I finally just wrote it all down into one book called, and when it first came out, it was called Writing for Comics with Peter David. It's the only book of mine that ever had my name large enough to keep my father happy. My name was like half the cover. Just like huge, and just looking and going, why can't all your books have your name this big? Which I thought was charming. It's since been redone and expanded. It's called Writing for Comics and Graphic Novels by Peter David. So go on Amazon and go get copies of that. Okay, well, that's it. That'll tell you everything you need to know.
And don't leave out the most important thing is you need to sit down, you need to write, and you need to go through the pain of it for reals. And you need to finish something.
Oh, definitely. Finishing something is probably the most important advice that you can give anyone.
Aside from starting something.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, everyone knows how to start something. Just,
You want to start something? No. Well, I mean, I've had so many people say to me, oh, you're a writer. I've always wanted to be a writer, but I've never had the time.
yes.
Which drives me nuts, because the implication is I'm not doing anything of particular importance, so obviously I have plenty of time to waste writing. But I'm not doing anything else that is more germane to the world.
Well, and on that note too, just, you know, I was a hairdresser before I became a comic book writer. And I
had hair before.
I had an extremely busy salon. I worked a lot of hours in that salon, and I wrote at night under a secret identity that my family didn't even know when I first started. If you want to be a writer, you need to have the passion to find time every day, hopefully, even if it's just a few minutes and then maybe more on weekends. When people tell me they want to write and they don't have time, it really upsets me, because I worked full-time at the salon and eventually full-time writing at the same time. So it could be done. You just have to want to do it really bad.
Oh, I mean, people say, how do you become a writer? And the answer is very simple. You become a writer because not being a writer is not an option. Characters and stories come to you with such force that you are compelled to write them down in as dramatic a fashion as you can, and then distribute it to as many people as you can, with your name ideally on it as large as it can possibly be, so people can see what it is that you have to say about various things. I mean, the only difference between us and the guys who wander down the streets muttering things incomprehensibly to themselves is that we are actually able to make money at it.
And to follow up on what Gail said, one great thing you can do is to treat it as a job, even if it's not a job. Like schedule time every day where you say, okay, from 7 to 8, this is my writing time. And make it something that you have to do, like an appointment that you have to keep. And you'll find how easy it is to make time to write when you do that.
Even if it's a few lines, and then the next day when you have your scheduled 10 minutes, you throw it all out, and you come up with 2 other lines, that's okay. That's how you find your voice. That's how you find your rhythm. That's how, you get yourself disciplined to sit down and write, because if you don't do that, you won't be a writer. You just won't.
So once you've gotten started and you've started to write and you've gotten yourself regimented and begun to, actually do it, how do you get it geared towards comics? Because writing for comics is a completely different animal than writing, say, a novel or a screenplay. How do you gear your writing towards a comic script or a comic pitch?
Well, you want to think visually. That's the main thing. If you're writing a novel, you can have two characters in a room for 27 pages and they're just talking to each other. And as long as the conversation is engaging, the reader will follow you. In a comic book, you always have to think, how is this going to look on the printed page? You have to think what you're going to be telling the artist to do. And you have to make it as visually compelling as possible. You also have to be realistic. You can't say, panel 1, the villain comes charging in the door, guns blazing. The cops turn and fire back. The villain leaps behind a desk to avoid the gun blazing. You know, what, panel 2? No. No.
Artist will kill you.
The artist will absolutely kill you. If you're Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, you could put panel 1, Spider-Man leaps into the window, rolls across the room, and fires his webbing. Steve Ditko could do that. No problem. If your artist is not Steve Ditko and you're not Stan, forget about it. You have to think about, you're basically telling the story of a movie frame by frame. Well, not frame by frame, you know, because it's like 24 frames in a second. But you know, you're picking a scene or part of a scene and breaking that down visually with the dialogue, with the action. You have to think about every single moment and how best to use the moments to convey your story.
And every single word of dialogue or exposition has to be carefully thought out and done to say as much as possible and as precisely as possible, because if you have a novel, you can kind of let that flow go for 27 pages.
Yes.
To have the conversation say a couple key points. In a comic book, absolutely not going to do it. Another way to get an artist to kill you is to have 27 pages of two people just talking.
Yeah.
So you've got to get the point across concisely, quickly, and precisely.
And as someone who also letters comics, the letterer will kill you if you just have a whole page of two people talking.
Just not using the medium to its full advantage if you do that.
I've done that exactly one time. I came up with an idea for a Batman story in which the Penguin has kidnapped Commissioner Gordon's wife. He's got her in a death trap somewhere in the city. They have managed to capture the Penguin, but they don't know where the wife is. And they know that the trap is going to go off at midnight. It's 11:37 p.m. They have the bat signal on, Batman is not responding to it. So it's an 18-page story. 16 pages of the story are Commissioner Gordon and the Penguin in a room, in the interrogation room, as Gordon has 18 pages to break the Penguin and find out where the hell his wife is. And the first 16 pages are two guys in a room. We had the editor loved the story. We had a miserable time getting artists for it. Artists are reading it going, but it's two guys in a room. And they're going, yes. And the editor said, yes, but you know, it's very visual and it's very compelling. And they're going, but it's two guys in a room. I have no idea how to draw this. We finally got a fantastic team. We got P. Craig Russell and Michael Gilbert, who did an amazing job with it. But like I said, that was a rarity. That was a rarity for me.
What do you think is the biggest challenge in adapting your thinking to reaching a wider audience? Because I know that, Joe, you write for a very wide audience when you write.
Sure.
You write
All ages.
all
stuff,
ages.
yeah.
What do you think is your biggest challenge when adapting to write for something like that? And do you have to write for a wide audience when you write for comics, or is it okay to kind of focus in?
Well, that would be better for someone like Gail or Peter.
Well, right,
David,
but
though.
it starts.
If you have to, because I have to write for a very general audience. And it's not very challenging because I don't really write it for kids. You know, like I do take the all ages thing very seriously, and I do try to gear it towards as wide of an audience as possible. And it's easy to stay within the guidelines of, the rules of what is appropriate for children. So it's not very challenging. I just write what I like to write, and the editor will tell me if it's out of bounds or not, which is rare. I mean, the thing I hate to hear from an editor when I'm writing an all-ages book is, yeah, but kids don't know what that is, or kids won't understand it. And I'm like, well, I learned how to understand stuff like this by reading comics, so I don't want to dumb it down for kids. Like, kids are curious enough and they're interested enough in these characters to try to figure it out. So.
And Gail, you write for oftentimes a more mature audience. Do you find that that writing for that audience presents a different set of challenges, or a set of challenges at all, or is it just an easy thing to do?
Well, for me, it's always going to be, do we have a compelling story that people are going to want to read? And then, like with Clean Room, I don't know how many people in here have read Clean Room. It's probably the most, thank you. It's probably the most adult thing I've written. So it's basically, you need to keep the reader engaged, and you can also go places that you cannot go in anything that's not a mature reader, which I love, but you've got to constantly keep that reader engaged enough with the content to keep them wanting to know what's happening in the rest of the story. I also have written and am writing all ages stuff, and it's still about having a story that people want to know what's going to happen next in it. And it's true, I have to, resist any dirty jokes or sexiness or, extreme violence that I might do in other comics, but it's still about the characters and the reader wanting to know what's going to happen next in their story.
I think J.K. Rowling has pretty much tossed aside the difference between stuff that's for kids and stuff that's for adults. I mean, how many people here have read the Harry Potter books? Now, how many of you were over 20 when you read them? Okay? The best joke I ever did, I came in late for a panel at San Diego. And I got there a couple minutes late. And it was an authors panel. And there were like 1,000 people in this room because it's freaking San Diego. And it was the weekend where the last Harry Potter book came out. And the woman who was moderating the panel says, "Peter, you're late," which, admittedly I was. And I said, I just thought of it off the top of my head. I said, "I'm so sorry. I just finished reading the last Harry Potter book, and I just needed a few minutes to compose myself." Show of hands, how many people cried when Hermione died in Ron's arms? And the place went nuts. Because half of them knew I was kidding, and half of them didn't. And it was best summarized by this one couple that I saw, where the woman is sitting there, and she's got the look like the poster of Scanners, right? With the guy going, and her husband is sitting next to her going, no, that doesn't happen, he's kidding. But at any rate, the Harry Potter books are ostensibly YA books. There's no sex, there's no profanity, with the exception of one word in the 7th book when she says, "Not my daughter, you bitch." The one bit of profanity in all of the books, and that's it. But it is unquestionably a story that cuts across all ages, and as Gail said, it really comes down to the story. If you're telling a compelling story, people want to read it, and they will not give a damn if it's in the YA section. And since then, there's been a host of YA novels that have adult appeal and have been made into movies that pull in, hundreds of millions of dollars. So the blurring, the line between adult and youth has really become pretty much negligible. Most of the comics I write can be read by all ages. I mean, the number of books that I write that are not all ages can literally be counted on the fingers of one hand. But I don't feel the least bit limited writing to a general audience. It's what it is. Spider-Man 2099 is not going to have explicit sex and profanity. We have profanity. He says shock all the time. What the hell that means, I have no idea. But I use it, and it's a tremendously useful word.
When you formulate, you were talking about, you had this idea of the Batman story, and when you come up with these ideas and these stories in your head and you conceptualize these things, how do they make it from it's the story to what we wind up seeing on the printed page? You mentioned pitching it to an editor and getting back and forth story feedback.
In the case of a story, I just wrote the story. I mean, I wrote the script. I mean, if anybody's interested, down at table P7, I'm actually selling samples of comic book scripts because, you know, that way you can actually see what a comic book script looks like. Now, the thing is, there's no absolute format for comic book scripts, unlike movie scripts, which all are absolutely rigidly identical. Comic book scripts are pretty much up to the various creators. The format I've come up with is I think, the best, but you know, that's my opinion. Coming up with a pitch for a character is a completely different thing. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was talking about Spider-Man 2099 before. Marvel Comics approached a number of writers, including me, and they said, we're going to be starting up the 2099 line, and we'd be interested in your take on what he would do for Spider-Man 2099. And all we were told was that he was going to be a technician who worked in an outfit called Alchemax. And that was pretty much all we had. And I sat down and I thought about it, and I said, okay, the first thing is, he's not going to be a descendant of Peter Parker. Because that's the most obvious thing. Peter Parker's grandson displays spider powers. Seriously? No, too obvious. So what I decided to do was zig everywhere that Stan and Steve zagged when they created the original. Peter Parker was a generic white bread, right? Standard wasp. The first thing I did was make him crossbreeding. I put two races that would not remotely go together. Mexican and Irish. I named him Miguel after Miguel Ferrer, an actor friend of mine. I gave him the last name of O'Hara because I wanted something that was indisputably Irish. Peter Parker was a teenager. Miguel was in his mid-20s. Peter Parker was an orphan. Miguel had a mother. Peter Parker was an only child. Miguel had a brother. Peter Parker had no idea of how to communicate with girls. Miguel had a fiancée. Peter Parker built the mechanical web shooters. Miguel would have organic web shooters. Peter Parker stuck to wall through basically static electricity when you get down to it. Miguel had talons on his fingers, which is why it broke me up when the fans were outraged that Tobey Maguire had biological spinnerets and talons on his fingers, because I'm going, guys, we did that. Huh? Peter Parker, as Spider-Man, would swing around the city. Miguel would have glider webbing on his back so that he would float around like spiders who get around by spinning parachute webbings, and they go floating around in nature. Spider-Man was a wisecracker, as Peter Parker basically would keep his mouth shut. Miguel was the opposite. Miguel was a wiseacre when he was Miguel. When he was Spider-Man, he basically was silent most of the time because he was focusing. You know, I did everything the opposite. A couple of weeks later, I get a call from the Marvel editor. He says, "We love your version of Spider-Man 2099. First of all, you're the only writer who didn't say that he was the descendant of Peter Parker." Wow. Okay! Do you want to write it? I'm going, sure! I had no idea what I was going to do for stories, but I said, sure! And I put myself into the character's shoes, and I proceeded to write Spider-Man 2099. But that's how I wound up writing it. Generally speaking, when we do pitches, at least at our level, we are asked to come in and put forward what we would like to do with a particular character or characters. And it's just a matter of how much ingenuity you have as a writer to come up with stuff that the editors are going to find compelling.
And sometimes too, like, if I take a character, I'll give you a couple of different examples. Writing for Wonder Woman, writing Batgirl, and writing Clean Room. For me, it's a little bit more about, with Wonder Woman, it took me about 8 months to figure out what tone, how I wanted her to present herself, what types of subject matters we would deal with, and that type of stuff, rather than just the story elements. And with Batgirl, no longer being Oracle, coming out of the chair and fighting crime, you know, as someone who was able-bodied, I started thinking about what that would mean. She's been through this horrible trauma. How are we going to bring that in through as part of her story? And then, because I tend to think about larger concepts before I focus down into the story elements itself and larger concepts and characters. And with Clean Room, it was about, I've kind of been fascinated by cults because I'm from the state of Oregon that has the largest number of cults per capita of any state in the U.S. And so I've grown up.
Are you just saying
it.
that off the top of your head, or that actually
That's true.
documented?
That's really a thing? Wow.
And there's a lot of hidden nooks in Oregon, let me tell you. Anyway, so hearing this all my life growing up, I'm fascinated with it, and then I'm fascinated with trends and things that people jump aboard and how society, different businesses and organizations want to control your money, control your thoughts, control your day, what you do with your day, and then this becomes Clean Room. How do I take this concept and create characters and then make a story that's going to explore those themes? So I work a little bit more that way before I focus it down in.
And pitches also, they vary wildly. Too.
Way different than writing a story too.
Oh,
Yeah, and no two pitches look the same either. Like sometimes it'll be a breakdown of a 6-issue story. Sometimes it'll be a general plot and like it really sets the mood. Sometimes it'll be 1 or 2 pages. Sometimes it'll be 8 to 10 pages. So it just depends on where you're going with it.
And you had mentioned that there are no set format for comic scripts.
Yeah.
What formats have each of you developed in your scripting when you're writing scripts for your letters and for your artists?
There's a couple things. When I first started, coming in as a hairdresser, I really had never seen an actual comic script before. And so I was working for Bongo writing The Simpsons, and they explained to me about 4 different choices of ways people did it, told me to pick what I thought was would work the best for me. So that's what I did, and that's kind of what I've stuck with all along. And I also have scripts at my table at P36. You can see what mine looked like. But one thing that I've learned over time is, which is kind of shocking, is that artists, colorists, inkers, letterers don't always sit down and read the complete script from front to back before they start working on it. So I tend to front load the script a lot in terms of, okay, note to artists, there's a new character in this issue and character description, or there's a new villain, a monster. Special note to colorists, this is all taking place, in the snow at twilight or whatever it is. And special note to letterer, Ragdoll's font is going to be, look this way in every word balloon that he has. That kind of stuff is really important because it's happened to me where an artist drew this beautiful page of this scary monster and the mouth was like this big, and later in the story it's supposed to swallow a subway. So, there's going to be a monster in this issue, and it has to have a mouth large enough to, swallow a subway. It's kind of how I front load the script. So there's special notes before I get into panel 1, page 1, panel 1. So that's just something I've learned over time, that don't assume everyone's going to read your script from front to back before they start working on it.
Good.
Oh, I was going to agree with Gail that my scripts, when you look at the first few pages, the panel descriptions are about 2 to 3 paragraphs just because I'm trying to explain every detail and set the scene properly. And then by page 20, it's like 3 words.
When I first started writing, I wrote in what is now referred to as the Marvel style, which basically what you're doing is writing the entire story, and it's like writing a short story in the present tense. You're describing what's happening in the action. Sometimes you put in dialogue. And you're leaving it entirely to the artist to figure out the storytelling and pace the story. I eventually stopped doing that for 2 reasons. Number one, a number of artists that I was working with had absolutely no freaking clue how to pace a story. And number 2, I was overloading the story. I was putting in too much for the artist to actually be able to put in there. So I switched to what's called full script, because that way I was giving the artist more information, and number 2, I was forcing myself to think more literally in terms of what was going to fit into the story. I wasn't leaving that all in the artist's hands because it wasn't fair to him, because sometimes the artist was leaving out stuff that I really needed to have in there because I was setting things up for future issues. A full script, essentially, I write it, I'll put panel A. I always letter the panels. I'll explain why in a moment. And I always put them in boldface so that it will pop up and be easily distinguishable. I put panel A, I describe what's in the panel. I would say, in this case, panel A, establishing shot of a large room that could also serve as a classroom in the university. 3 people are sitting at a table and 1 person is standing at a podium while the classroom looks on. Okay, that would be panel A. Then I would put Peter, 1. Okay, the reason that I number the dialogue is because it's going to wind up being the balloon placements are going to be put on the page by the editor or the assistant editor. And the balloon placements are going to be numbered, because those are then going to go to the letterer, who's going to go, okay, in balloon 1, I'm going to put this dialogue. Balloon 2 will be this dialogue. So I number the dialogue pages for the convenience of the letterer, and I letter the panels so that they will be easily distinguishable from the numbered dialogue pages, numbered dialogue, so the two cannot possibly get confused. And I would do that for panel A, and then I would put panel B, close shot on Peter, Peter, 2, right? And so on. And that's how I go through the entire page. And I do that for 20 pages, and I send it to the editor, and they invoice it and send me money.
Well, I suppose that is the actual end game, is to send out the invoice and get the money back.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So I'd like to open up the floor for some questions from the, okay, all right.
That was quick.
I think the neatest thing about this panel is that I actually see people taking notes, which is very cool. Yes, so hopefully you're prepared for the quiz. The mic in the front should be live if you want to come up, or you can speak from your seat. Go ahead, Tim.
Yes, very nice to meet you. It's been an honor just sharing the stories with you, and a lot of inspiration to me as a young artist. I also noticed that you've done comics for Spider-Man and Batman, and wouldn't that be considered fan fiction, or how is it that you're able to write these stories that were already established, but you can write these new stories with? Do you get permission to write Spider-Man or Batman? Do they ask you to write the stories for Batman and Spider-Man?
We're hired.
Hire you.
We're hired, yeah.
It's work for hire.
Oh, yes, it absolutely is. Saying that it's fan fiction is actually quite legitimate. I mean, when I saw Encounter at Farpoint, when I was watching it on TV, just like all you guys, who were, born at that point, I'm watching Q, and I'm sitting there, and I'm going, Jesus Christ, this guy's just like Trelane, the Squire of Gothos. It's essentially the same freaking character. What happens? A number of years later, I write a book called Q Squared, which has Q and the Squire of Gothos in it. So, yes, in some elements, it could actually be fan fiction. The only difference is that we get paid for this stuff.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
You're welcome. Next question.
Well put.
As you mentioned earlier, comic books don't have room for all the filler that can transition between important scenes. For example, someone gets in a taxi and spends 20 days talking to the taxi driver on the way to the next scene. When you're writing for comics, how do you decide what details are important to have in the transition between items?
Well, I can tell you the first thing you almost never want to show. Somebody entering or exiting a room. Going into and out of a room is one of the most visually boring things you can possibly put in there. So always start your scene. I mean, unless the entrance is a villain slamming open the door going, ah! Entrances and exits you can pretty much forget. Just start your scene in the room. You'd be amazed how much time that alone will save. Even on television, people are usually already in a room. When you see people walk into a room on television, you're sitting there going, really? And it's just a matter of thinking about the most important thing that's going to be in the scene and just having the most important thing. You're telling your story as absolutely succinctly as you can. I mean, I found that on the occasions when I've done a comic book version of a movie. You know, when they send you a movie script is 120 pages. Comic book script, generally speaking, for a movie adaptation, about 48. Around 48 pages.
Yeah, usually it's pretty common that if the comic book is 20 pages, the script will be 40 for me. It's almost double what the actual page count is.
Right. So, you know, you have to think, what is the bare essentials of what we can do to tell the story as interestingly as possible? And it's just a matter of like being laser focused on what's important.
Well, and you learn too, this is one thing that I love about comic books, is it's a participatory experience, because you are expected as a reader to fill in what's going on between those panels, and when you become a writer, you learn what to trick your readers into filling in between those panels. And it's like Peter said, you want to take the most interesting pieces and show that on the page for your art's sake, for the reader's sake, for everyone's sake. But you can cleverly use those little breaks between the panels that people's brains will fill it in. And I think that's one really cool thing, and one thing that I get into because I love manipulating y'all.
Don't we know?
And to follow up on what Peter was saying, I do a lot of adaptations of the Marvel animated series, and I have to cut out so much of the episode to make it fit in 20 pages. It's crazy. And my trick is to, for every scene, just basically start in the middle. Like Peter said, don't show people entering a room. Like, show them in mid-conversation. Just cut to the chase, and only show people what is interesting about that scene, and cut out the
They'll
nonsense.
fill in how they got
Yeah.
there.
Sarah?
No problem.
If you are writing an ongoing series, not like a standalone, like a movie to a comic adaptation or something like that, how far in advance are you writing issues, and how frequently are you writing them? Like, do you write 2 issues a month, 1 issue a month?
1 or 2 issues a month.
Right.
I generally work 6 to 8 months ahead of time, which is why it was so exciting when I started on the new run of Spider-Man 2099, because the editor called me. What happened was, Steve Wacker wrote that Marvel was developing a Spider-Man 2099, a new 2099 comic book, and fandom, in pretty much one of the only instances I can think of, reacted with one voice, which was, everyone said, I would totally buy Spider-Man 2099 comic book as long as Peter David was writing it. And I wasn't writing it. And apparently everyone at Marvel said, why aren't we having Peter write this? So whoever the poor schmuck was who was working on it before me got fired off the book before he wrote a single word. And I got called by the editor, and she said, we'd like to know if you'd like to write a Spider-Man 2099 book. I said, sure. When's the first issue? She said, July. And I said, it's May. And she said, I know, you're really late. And by the way, we need a 5-page story by tomorrow to run in Spider-Man, the new Spider-Man #1. I'm going, okay. And you just had to frequently you have to hit the ground running. So I hope you like that 5-page story, because I wrote it inside of half an hour with no freaking clue where I was going to go with the book. But you know, so aside from when I first started on the book and was, you know, several months late, I generally work about 6 to 8 months ahead. How about you?
Yeah, that's the goal. It's not always what happens, but it needs to be 6 months ahead. Because you have to remember, the script starts with the writer, and then it goes to a penciler, and then an inker, and then a colorist, and then a letterer, and then production. And so if anybody gets off track in any of that time, it's going to throw the schedule off, and the schedule is everything in
Oh,
you know,
God,
monthly
yes.
book. So that's why there's that time difference. And for me, if I was going to average it out, I'd say I can write a script about a week at this point in time. You know, it hasn't all, because you build your toolbox and you learn what makes things easier and work better and flows more smoothly for you. So that's kind of an average.
I'm not nearly working 6 to 8 months ahead.
I said that was the goal, remember?
Yeah, that's definitely the goal. I'm usually about 3 months ahead, but a lot of the stuff I write are they're not full issues. I do like 11 pagers, stuff for Disney Magazine and stuff like that. So.
Well, the other thing that factors in, aside from the production time, is the promotions department can wind up getting involved. Sometimes you'll come up with something and the editor's going to go, oh my God, that's great, we can promote the living crap out of this, we're going to circulate this to the promotions department. And the promo department needs months to get everything together. Because that's what happens when you work for a major company.
Yeah, and even if it's going to the regular book market, even longer.
Oh God, yes.
Sir?
I wanted to know, with the advent of like internet comics and web comics, some artists have kind of been trying to test what they can do with the comic medium. Has there been anything that you've wanted to do but hasn't been artistically viable from a traditional medium?
No. Sometimes the answer is no. I'm sorry. You guys?
Well, that's hard to say because there was a point in time where I didn't necessarily know that you were going to have this contraption where you could delete and move things around. And you
We used to use this stuff called whiteout or liquid paper.
Oh my.
We used carbon paper.
And then some people like to speak, what they write and have someone else dictate it. I can't do that. That would just make me absolutely nuts because I have to have total control of the situation. But it's hard to know what might come in the future that we, haven't thought of yet. It's a little different, I think, with artists because they're creating, they've got 1D, 2D, 3D, 700D, whatever, motion, not motion. It's more than just words for them.
Yeah, Marvel does these things called Infinity Comics that I've written a couple of, where the characters actually move on the page as part of the comic reading process. It's like one step away from writing animation. It's so freaking cool because I wrote my scripts and all I did was write my scripts, and then I'm seeing the final version. I'm going, holy crap, this is so cool.
Sir?
I got a question about working with the majors when they decide to do a global event. When you've scripted ahead, how far do they know that they're going to completely scrap their line?
I don't like every 2 weeks. I don't.
Well, sometimes it seems like that.
When they're going to scrap their
Well,
line.
like a rebirth.
Oh. This is DC. Over to you, Gail. I got nothing.
It's like every 5
I
years.
can't speak for everyone and everyone's books, but I will say that in the past when this has happened, like we had Plastic Secret 6, and it was canceled to make room for the New 52. And then now we have New 52 Secret 6, which is canceled to make room for Reboot. But I was given time to finish out the story, to make it a whole complete story that made sense and didn't have to be truncated and things like that. So I was given enough time. That isn't always the case, so it's just the nature of the business.
Did DC really do a thing that said that Dr. Manhattan created the DC universe? Is that true?
Okay, stop. I haven't read it. I'm like the only person in the world that hasn't read it.
Quite possible.
I haven't.
Well, I haven't read it, but I haven't read it. All I've been reading is the internet and watching the fans' heads freaking explode. Pretty entertaining.
Sir?
Yes. Once you have your script, what I would like to know is where do you go from there? Like, how do you get it? If you're not already part of the business, how do you get into it? I guess is that idea.
You want to know how to break in once you've written
Yeah.
scripts?
Once you have your script, where do you go from there, basically?
Well, okay. Marvel and DC and probably a couple of the other companies out there don't normally take unsolicited scripts.
Yeah, they used to, but
Yeah,
now they don't.
don't. So let me just save you guys some time and heartache right up front by letting you know that. So my suggestion would be, unless you're like part of a contest or something that they've invited you to participate in, is to create something of your own or go to a smaller company and start there where they will look at an unsolicited script. You can get stuff online, you can pair up with an artist, complete something short, small, whatever you want to do. But like I said, if you have written out a complete Batman script, for instance, they just don't take unsolicited scripts anymore.
If you look in your program, we actually have a panel on breaking into comics.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
Good.
actually. So, and off the top of
So
my
many
head.
ways to do it.
What is it?
Yes, off the top of my head, I can't tell you when it is, but it's both.
Oh, yeah,
Okay,
it's
everyone
6
wants
tonight.
to flip
It's
through
6
the
tonight.
program
It's
book?
this evening at 6. See?
Opposite my Q&A. Excellent.
Sorry. Go ahead, sir.
All right. When I'm reading comics, one thing that occasionally pulls me out of it is when a writer gives a bit of dialogue to a character that would not fit to that character. They just get it wrong. So I'm just wondering, what do you guys do to make sure that the character's voice is correct and authentic? How do you make sure the character's speaking right? And could you give me an example of a character and how they should sound?
I frequently read my dialogue aloud. You would be amazed. You would be amazed. No, just me. You would be amazed how many dialogue screw-ups you can catch when you're reading it out loud. Everything from that the character would say that to just flat-out typos that totally change what the character was saying. That's generally the best way to go about it. I mean, ideally, you should know the character correctly enough that that you wouldn't write him saying something that he would not say. Every character should have a unique voice. Every character should talk differently. His motivation should be different. That's just a fundamental aspect of writing. And if you're not able to come up with individual character voices, maybe you shouldn't be a writer, because that's really just a part of it.
It helps to have an ear for it, but one example I think that might illustrate the point is, let's take Birds of Prey, Oracle, Black Canary, and the Huntress. Barbara Gordon has a photographic memory. She's extremely brilliant. She, spends her entire life trying to help people and make Gotham better. So when you write her dialogue, you're going to use maybe a little bit more advanced vocabulary for one thing. I mean, there's just little tricks like that you can do with a character that is going to be, more brilliant and verbal than the other ones. With Black Canary, the way that I wrote her, she wears her heart on her sleeve. She's a little bit snarky, more action-oriented, so you're going to write to that. With Huntress, she's a little bit more on the edge. You don't quite know what she's going to do, so you're going to make sure that her dialogue is reflecting those kinds of things. And Lady Blackhawk, she's from a different time period, so you need to know how the cadence and the vocabulary and such from that time period goes. And you just have to really be good at deconstructing and then constructing it back together. And those are just a little bit of tricks. So like Peter said, you've got to know your character. But those are the kinds of things you need to know that will inform how they speak. And please, for the love of God, when you're writing dialogue, do not write one word or phrase that you've ever heard before, because you are not writing dialogue at that point. You are dictating. If I see one more, I'm too old for this shit, or
Not today.
those type of phrases, I'm just gonna explode. Dialogue, especially in comic books, is really important because it will, like you said, take you right out of the story because you're like, whoa,
Yeah.
Oracle probably wouldn't say she's too old for this shit,
And your editors will tell you when they'll be very happy to point out, like, Captain America would not say something like this. And you're like, oh. Yeah, you're right. I better go back and change that.
Well, Red Sonja speaks completely different than any of those other female characters that I was talking about earlier. Same way with Wonder Woman. And that's the other thing that used to drive me insane in the industry, is that like female characters all seem to have like one voice forever. And it's so important, the distinction you can make between the different voices, different body shapes, different motivations for what they're doing. Don't write or dialogue stereotypes.
I have time for one more quick question.
There's one? We have 10 minutes left.
They have to turn the room over.
Oh, so you told me it was a 60-minute panel, but it's a 50-minute panel. Okay.
It's a 55-minute panel.
Ah, well,
That's why I have time for one more.
well, but we have 5 minutes then.
Right.
We need at least 2 or 3 more questions.
Oh, okay, go.
I'm most interested in
do sketches and how many pages you're going to lay out?
I write a script, it takes me about 3 to 4 hours to write a comic book script. From the point where I sit down to write it until it's done, about 3 to 4 hours. Well, I type fast.
Yeah.
No, seriously, I type
Once I
fast.
sit down, and if I'm going to write straight through, it doesn't take so long either. But don't tell the editors. The time up to the thinking and the planning and the
Oh,
getting
sure.
everything right is what takes the time.
Oh yeah, there'll be times where I'm sitting there just staring off
Yeah.
into air, and my wife says, "You're thinking about a script, aren't you?" And I'll go,
Yeah.
"What? Oh, yeah."
You weren't counting the 3 hours of staring and the 3 hours
Right.
of.
Now, there are other authors who actually write full breakdowns. Dan Slott told me, he said, you should try writing like breakdowns before writing scripts. I went, really? And he says, yeah, because he says, I sit down and I write a breakdown of every script before I write it. And, it saves me time later on. It takes me about 6 to 7 hours, but I sit down and write a breakdown. And I go, it takes you 6 to 7 hours to write a breakdown? He says, yeah, why? And I said, it takes me 4 hours to write a script. He says, oh, forget about it then.
I guess the moral is everyone works a little bit
Differently,
differently.
yeah.
People who are writers and artists, sometimes they do it all at once.
Yes.
They are gifted that way. But for me, it's a lot of thinking, and I don't always write in order. So I don't know if Peter sits down and does 3 or 4 hours and writes from beginning to end. I don't
Yeah,
always do
beginning to
that.
end.
Many times I write the end first, or I know there's key scenes, and then I've got to work the connective tissue between. So there's no right or wrong way to go about that.
Okay. We can take another question.
There you go, I told you.
In the green.
Who's your favorite characters that you didn't work on?
I swear to God, dude, I've worked on all of them. So I can't think of anyone off the top of my head that I haven't worked on. So I got no answer to that.
Okay.
For me, it would be Mary Marvel, Captain Marvel.
Worked on her. she was in I wrote her a 2-parter of Supergirl. So yeah.
Yeah, like writing a lot of all ages stuff where they have me writing all different characters every month. I think I've written pretty much every character I've wanted to, I guess with the exception of Superman. The one time I did have the chance to write a Superman story, they asked me if I would make it Supergirl. So my answer is Superman.
Yeah, I've written Superman. And he's never written back. Now we have time for one more question.
We do. We have time for, okay, there you go. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So speaking to people who are both comic writers and artists, how does any company really treat those people, because they seem like gods among men, honestly. No offense to you guys, you're all amazing. Whoops.
How do they treat them?
Oh my.
They treat them like employees. I mean, when it gets right down to it, some employees, they make more money, but they're treated like employees by the companies because that's ultimately what they are.
I feel like, off the top of my head, a lot of people who have the gift to do both tend to do creator-owned stuff.
Yeah.
And be very successful at it. Terry Moore,
Jeff Smith. Yeah. Okay, so that's it.
Guys, I want to thank you all so much for coming, and I want to thank our panelists. I hope you had a wonderful time. They will be at their tables in the comic special guest section.